Hello, everybody. Welcome for yet another edition of Consciousness Hour. We've dropped the Anthony Peake because we decide that's far too egotistical. And in my opinion, Sarah is just as much an integral part of this team as I am. And for this new kind of streamed down version, Sarah and I decided that what we would do is we'd like to talk about Sarah's new book. Now, I haven't actually read the book. I know its genesis and I know its background and everything as well, but it gives us an opportunity to know a little bit about the mysterious lady that is Sarah James, because although we've interviewed her on this show a couple of times before, there'll be many of the new people involved who won't know a great deal about Sarah. Now, I first met Sarah. We were in contact on Facebook for quite a time beforehand, but I first really contacted Sarah when we were involved in an amazing event, a very bizarre event at the same token, at Drakelow Caves in Worcestershire in the UK, when we were involved in a recreation of Plato's Cave, which still within our little group is still one of those kind of events, life events that we still talk about and revert back to, together with the wonderful hotel we ended up in, which made the Bates Motel look like Crossroads. It was that bizarre. But one of the things that I've always wanted to know is a little bit more about Sarah and her background and everything else. And I know that from messages I've received, an awful lot of people are also very interested in Sarah and what makes her tick. And we'll be talking about her book. So this is going to be completely informal. Because we're not going to be able to monitor the questions coming in effectively, so we may not be able to respond to the questions. So my apologies on that. But without further ado, okay, Sarah, tell us all about yourself. How did you start in all this all those years ago?
In lucid dreaming, I've always had lucid dreams. I can't remember a time when I didn't have lucid dreams and didn't have an interesting dream life and wasn't into dreams. I can remember dreams from being a toddler. I think I've said so many times, I've done so many podcasts and like radio shows recently that I'm kind of repeating myself over and over again. So I'm not sure what I've said to you.
Yeah, you get this terrible feeling of deja vu, don't you? You know, and you think, have I already said that? Is the real fear that you have.
I'm sure I probably have. So the first dream I remember, and this was one of the things that really interested me about the time that we interviewed Rebecca Sharrock. With Highly Superior Autobiographical Memory, we were talking about how our really early dreams were all white, and then we remember them being filled in. And I distinctly remember dreams being all white. And then I remember this dream where I was playing with my Fisher-Price chat-along phone and it started ringing, and it was Wurzel Gummidge telling me that he had just killed my nan. And I remember this. We interviewed Rebecca Sharrock.
My apologies.
That's right. I remember the episode that particularly terrified me of Wurzel Gummidge, and I was looking it up actually recently to sort of check my facts, and it was one where he was taking his head off and throwing it off of the back of a lorry or like a sort of flatbed truck. And I think I would have been like 3 or 4 when that episode came out. So I think that's when I can track that dream back to. But interestingly, as I was mentioning this in another podcast or radio show the other day, someone commented that they remember their first dreams being all white. And then first things they saw in it were their favorite toys. So I thought that was quite interesting.
So just explain then, so that the dream is all white. But what you then see is then coloured within that, or is everything white within it? In which case, everything's white against a white background.
First of all, it's just like a pure whiteness, and then that whiteness seemed to me to become a room. And I don't know how much I'm applying my own kind of narrative thinking to it now, but I definitely have this recollection of this pure white space. And then as I got older, first of all, it was toys, and then it was animals and people, and then landscapes and sort of architecture, rooms and things like that. But I remember this like long period of just all white dreams, or just with small features in them, like toys especially. I remember because I really loved my toys when I was little, and I can remember that chat along phone especially. I see it all the time now in like charity shops every time I go into
So from then, I mean, initially they were just dreams. So they were very much early dreams, but they were just dreams. They weren't, well, I suppose one could argue they are lucid. Actually, just as an opportunity here, just explain to everybody out there, when you use the term lucid dream, what exactly are you talking about here? Just so we've already defined the territory.
So the term lucidity is coined by Frederick van Eden, who was I think it was a psychiatrist, and he was into lucid dreaming himself. So he kind of coined the phrase, and it's come to mean a dream in which you're aware of the fact that you're dreaming, and sort of neuroscientifically speaking, it's when your frontal cortex is active and you're, unusually for a dream state, and you're able to use critical thinking and self-reflection and know who you are. For me, it is very much about remembering the fact that you're in a dream and remembering who and where you are within that dream. Like, you have this amazing sense of like conscious awareness and omnipotence. And one of the things that I also really associate with it, and it's led to my interest in exploring the ancient history and culture of lucid dreaming, is this sense of bliss and euphoria that you get, and which I think ancient people would use a term like divine dreaming instead, like a divine dream where you're visited by a divine presence, or you have a revelation, maybe a vision of the future, or a spontaneous healing event occurs within a dream.
And have you experienced that?
Yeah, I did have a good dream where I met the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda, and he infused my body with light. I was standing in my old house where I grew up, and we had like this tiny little square landing that had like 3 doors that came off of it to everyone's bedrooms. It was just this tiny little square, and there was a loft hatch above it. And in my dream, I was standing there, and Ahura Mazda came down from the sky. And, one of the fascinating things about lucid dreaming is you are conscious of the fact that you're not like an avatar seeing from like your own personal point of view. You're kind of omnipotent vision wise. You can see close up and far away. You can see from multiple perspectives. So in this dream, I became aware of Ahura Mazda coming down from the heavens, and I saw him kind of walk into my body. And it wasn't just a sort of vision of me standing away from my body. I could also see close up, and I could see that my DNA spirals were untwisting and turning into ladders for him to walk down into. So I could see close up and far away at the same time. And then as he walked, because he's the god of light and the sun in Zoroastrian religion, as he walked down the rungs of my DNA ladders, he was like lighting up, and I felt amazing and euphoric and blissful. I did have another dream once I started to research this idea of dream medicine and being healed within a dream, where a god, a bit like the man from Del Monte in like a white linen suit, came into my dream and said that I had to fast for 3 days.
Very interesting. So in terms of the Ahura Mazda dream, you presumably were aware of the concept of Ahura Mazda because you were able to recognize that that's who it was? Yeah. And was that because it was an archetype of the way the imagery of Ahura Mazda works within Zoroastrianism?
I think what we'd had because I run this lecture club down in St. Leonard's, and I think it was quite close to when Greg Sams came and talked about his book, Son of God, in which he wrote about the sun being conscious and being an actual God that we can all worship. So I got really into Ahura Mazda, and I'm really into sea swimming and sun worshipping in general. Like, the sun is my God. So I often swim in the sea and scream the name of Ahura Mazda. So yeah, I think that there was a bit of background to that.
Yeah, so it's your own version of Geronimo then, only it's Ahura Mazda. Because I saw a cartoon recently which I thought was quite good. It was the conquistadors arriving in Mexico, Aztec Mexico, and there's an Aztec priest there, and there's the Spaniard, and the Spaniard's turning around and saying, that about the Christian God. And the Spaniards turn around saying, well, you just worship the sun. And the guy turns around and he said, well, at least the sun is real, and it's an interesting point, isn't it? The idea that you can see the rationale behind the way in which those things developed anthropologically and everything else as well. But going back then, because one of the great things that have always intrigued me, as I've said in various interviews, I've experienced now 2 lucid dreams, and it was probably the most extraordinary events ever. But of course, lucid dreaming is very, very similar to the out-of-body experience in many ways. And I know this is the billion-dollar question, and I know it's asked many, many times, but what do you consider to be the difference? Because presumably have you had OBEs as well?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the difference? You've experienced both. So from your experiential opinion, what is the difference and how can you tell?
I think it's all on a spectrum, and it's more about the sort of qualia of individual events rather than distinctions between different states. I think that it's a continuum of consciousness, and that there aren't clearly defined boundaries between lucid dreaming, astral projection, out-of-body experiences. I think they can all be blended. You can have a near-death experience within a lucid dream. You can have a lucid out-of-body experience. You can have a false awakening out-of-body experience. I don't think that the categorizations are particularly helpful.
Mm. Yeah, because it's one of the big issues, isn't it? Because I've read, in the past when I was doing research on my book on the out-of-body experience, and one of the arguments that was used was that there's within an OBE, there is a transition out of the body, and you're aware of coming out of your body and going somewhere. Whereas with a lucid dream, you find yourself already you are transposed straight away and you're already there. Is that how you would describe it?
No, for me, my favorite way of having lucid dreams is to do the wild technique, where you have a wake-induced lucid dream. And that can feel very much like an out-of-body experience, but usually exiting your body through sinking down. So I experience entering into a lucid dream as like Alice falling down the rabbit hole, and I describe that sort of hypnagogic process as falling down through your body and out the other side rather than rising up. And the only I don't really get sleep paralysis, but I have had an experience of having a dream that I found it hard to get out of. It was like I was stuck in the dream body. There are so many factors for anomalous phenomena, from like carbon monoxide leaking out of your boiler to sleep deprivation, to sleep apnea, which you might not necessarily be aware of. So you stop breathing in the middle of the night and you don't know this. You just, it affects your dream experiences, things that you eat, sounds that you're hearing while you're asleep. There's so many factors that I think like everything needs to be assessed on a sort of case-by-case basis.
Oh, right. Okay. Because that's intriguing, isn't it? Because, you read some people are quite definite and they say, oh, no, it's definitely an out-of-body experience, or it's definitely an OBE. But something you touched upon there also fits in with this, doesn't it? The concept of hypnagogia or hypnopompia, where, because I get that regularly, and I always have had. And my hypnagogic states happen spontaneously while I'm awake, while I'm at work, or whenever I am. And I've cited many times the first time I had a hypnagogic experience, it was extraordinary, because I was at work, I was in the office, I was in front of my computer, and I started to feel as if I was going into a state that I would call the aura state of the prodrome of a migraine attack. And I felt those sensations, but I was suddenly somewhere completely different. And I was looking down, I was in a tree, and I was looking down at an elderly gentleman sitting reading a newspaper. And, you're going, what is this? I know I'm in an office at Stansted Airport, but I'm also looking at this scene. And then I raised my head and I had a full vision of a square. And it was kind of a big old square. It reminded me slightly of the Plaza Mayor in the center of Madrid, but I knew it wasn't. I knew it was somewhere like Buenos Aires or something. And in the far corner, there was an ambulance with its siren going along the far corner. And it's like it was in my periphery vision, as if I wasn't really focusing on it. And the minute I focused in on it, it disappeared. And I remember sitting there for a few minutes going, what on earth was that? And then a few days later, it happened again, only this time I was looking up through a glass table, and there was an elderly lady with kind of pinky dyed hair. And she was drinking a cup of coffee, and she was placing the coffee mug on the glass table as I was looking up at it. And I concluded that what was happening in both those occasions was that in the first one, I was in the visual position of a bird looking down. And in the other one, I was either a cat or a dog or something looking up at its master. And what is curious about them, both those occasions are so vivid to me. I can see them now, it's not, you don't forget them, do you? They're part of you. Whereas the mystery of dreaming is that we forget it, or it becomes subliminal in some way. Whereas with you, you've developed techniques whereby you can control this more. And is this the basis of the new book then? I mean, what?
Well, that's one thing that I would mention about lucidity, actually, before we talk about the book, is that lucid dreams, you do remember really well. They don't evaporate. So that's one of the qualities that lucid dreaming has. It's not subject to the same kind of laws of memory as ordinary dreaming. And I mean, even vivid dreams, if you get a good feedback system going of remembering and writing them down. I mean, this is one of the areas that interests me most about dreaming, is the weirdness of dream memory, because I think that it suggests there's some sort of unconscious, subconscious memory network that we don't know how to access during ordinary waking consciousness. And when we're in dreams, quite often, especially if we have regular episodes of lucidity, you get this sense of the fact that you can remember other dreams and other dream lives and other dream experiences that you only have access to when you're remembering yourself in a dream state and not in waking consciousness. I remember, I think Sam Treasure told me about having those dreams that she was a Japanese woman living in Japan, which led her to move to Japan and learn Japanese. And it was like she was living this other life in the dream version of herself. So, you know, I think that the imaginal state, the dream state, gets really neglected, but it's the power of imagination and the ability to conjure up images and rich visual scenes is incredible in and of itself. But because of this habit of forgetting, and perhaps we've got more used to forgetting our dreams. Perhaps ancient people didn't forget their dreams as much as we do now, because they didn't have the same sort of distractions. They had perhaps a more integrated subconscious conscious memory system to us because of the nature of their lives. Maybe we aren't supposed to forget our dreams. It's a kind of evolutional situation. I don't know.
Let's ruminate and discuss this a little bit further. I really found that quite fascinating, the idea that we have access to memories and incidents in our dream past that we don't normally have in our everyday thinking brain. And funnily enough, I've spent the last day reading a book written by our next guest, which is Melvin Morse, who's going to be joining us on Sunday. And Melvin is very similar to myself in the sense he's quite fascinated by this concept of holographic memory and the idea that memory is held holographically within the brain, or indeed allows us access to the greater information field that sits outside of us, be it the 0 point field or whatever we want to call it. But this is going into our own personal narrative, and it's going into all the dreams that we've had. And it's almost as if we access another version of ourselves while we're in the dream state, another version of ourselves that has access to learning we don't have. And it's intriguing, isn't it? So have you any examples of things you have discovered about yourself in a dream state that you wouldn't ordinarily access under normal circumstances? Is that a fair question?
Well, one of the activities that I really like to do to encourage lucid dreaming is dream mapping. So that is where you describe, illustrate, map out the dream space, because I've had quite a kind of defined dream landscape since I was a kid, because I have been drawing it and writing it down, and it's like my own wonderland. And I think there is an element there of, because I was into Alice in Wonderland as a kid, because my dreams made me into Alice in Wonderland, and then because I've been drawn to other films and other artwork that's about dreaming, my dream aesthetic is very much kind of dictated by the kind of art and books that I was into. Like, I always loved those imaginary maps of things like Tolkien and stuff like that, or Alice in Wonderland, those kind of. So I started to draw maps like that when I was a kid. And actually, I'm just looking at the YouTube comments here. Someone mentioned different locations in dreams. And I think one of the things for me with regards to being able to remember stuff is when I go to locations in dreams that I remember. And there are very often these kind of junctions in dreams, like you'll go to a train station, or there'll be like modes of transportation, or there'll be particular themes and motifs that, if you're really familiar with your dream landscape, will remind you that you're dreaming, and then you'll start to remember other journeys that have happened from these locations, and that brings back this kind of flood of memory. And then sometimes it hits you like a tsunami. You feel like, I can't cope with the amount of memory that is potentially on the cusp of me, being fully remembered. So I think there is something about this process of forgetting. In the ancient Greek tradition, you have mnemosony for remembering yourself within the dream and remembering your dream, and lethe to forget everything you know so far, to be fully conscious and present when this dream experience happens, in the sort of oracular tradition of somewhere like Trophonius. So there is usefulness in forgetting, I imagine, in terms of perhaps detoxification, of integration, of forgetting things that you don't necessarily need to focus on the things that are really important. So there probably is some benefit for the act of forgetting, but maybe some residue of everything remains. And beyond our own individual lives, perhaps the remembrance is of the creation of the universe, the source of the cosmos. So we're literally remembering everything in those dream spaces, potentially. I mean, I kind of have an intuition or a theory that, REM and those dreams that we have when we are, where we can obviously see that people are having rapid eye movement, they're our individual personal dreams. And when we go into deep sleep, slow wave, delta sleep, we're having a cosmic dream that we don't necessarily remember. But those, when you do wake people up from deep sleep and from delta wave sleep, sometimes they are having dreams. And I think they're the dreams that are more perhaps cosmic or predictive of the future, or interconnected with the consciousness of the planet or other people.
Well, that's intriguing, isn't it? In many ways, there's so many issues there. And the idea, and I love this idea of dream mapping. And I know a number of people that have been involved in my work over the last 2 decades that do exactly the same. That they're mapping the environment that they go in their dreams. And they know where something is going to be, and it's consistent. So it is a kind of a mirror image of this reality that has its own integral reality within it, and it's an interesting point, as Hurley Burley has just said, our mutual friend, in the chat room, and he's pointed out, the movie Inception, and the idea in Inception, where you drop in to a set of circumstances. And I've always been very intrigued by that. I mean, there was one friend of mine, Mark, who was controlling his environment, and again was mapping it. And it was a school that I think it was a school he'd never actually been to, but an alternate version of himself had been to that school. And he was mapping the school, and he knew where the rooms were, where the maths room were, where everything else was. And when he went back, it was always in the same position. And of course, again, I'm thinking here of that wonderful film that one of our friends did, based upon Robert Monroe's concept of I there. I can't think of his name now, but he did this wonderful film of a guy consistently dreaming of the same place, this village, this magical village. And he actually, in the short movie, he filmed this. He used as a location this really strange place in Croatia. Very, very interesting. And he goes there and he becomes somebody else. He drops in to somebody else's reality, as if they're seeing through the eyes of somebody else. And I know a number of friends of ours have said this, haven't they? That, that when you go there, you are not you are I there. You are somebody else. And you're experiencing their life as if you're a drop-in.
Reminds me of that episode of The Next Generation, The Inner Light, where Picard goes and lives out a whole other life after he gets probed by Probe. And he has a kind of out-of-body experience where he lives on another planet for 30 years and he has a wife and family. And then he wakes up and he's got to start all over again. I mean, that's the amazing thing, isn't it? Like, one of the reasons why I loved dreams so much when I was a kid was that you could experience these whole other lives and worlds within one single night, within half an hour even. So that time dilation is fascinating to me as well. And one of the issues with time dilation, and one of the interesting things about lucid dreaming that I think happens, is that lucid dreaming is said to occur according to the same sort of parameters we have in terms of time perception. You should experience a lucid dream similarly, because it's happening in real time, but you do get this enriched sense of time perception, because you're not experiencing time from one location, you're experiencing time from multiple perspectives. So you have this rich kind of 4D experience of time, which feels incredibly luxurious. So even though time is occurring in the same way it is if you were awake, it's this much deeper feeling of time, because you're you're experiencing time simultaneously from multiple different infinite perspectives. So I think this is why people wake up quite often when they start becoming lucid, because it's quite an overwhelming experience.
Is time linear in that sense, or do you flick back within a dream? Do you flick back into earlier elements of the dream, or different elements of the dream, or different viewpoints of the dream?
Yeah, I don't think it's linear at all. I remember seeing paintings by, Pablo Amaringo, who's the shaman. I think he's an Amazonian shaman who does paintings inspired by ayahuasca visions. And when I saw his paintings, that really, to me, expressed the way I experienced the dream, which is more like a kind of tapestry of things occurring simultaneously that you pick out. Your attention chooses what you're picking out in that particular moment. But as is our habit, when we're rewriting things that happened in a dream, we tend to string those events out into a linear form, because that's just how, writing works. So maybe that's another element of how our perception of time has shifted alongside language, because we tend to have to order things in a particular way. We can't represent them artistically in like a tapestry type of situation. We have to kind of they have to adhere to a particular perception of time.
That's interesting. So what you're saying is that in many ways the dreamscape is created by our use of language as well. Our use of language manipulates and fabricates the dream reality in some way. So for instance, I know that you're an expert on hieroglyphics. So in terms of, say, the records, or anything you've discovered about the dreaming in terms of the ancient Egyptians, I mean, what can we learn from that in terms of our trying to understand this alternate universe?
Egyptian language really switched me on to thinking about dreams as being almost like a visualized wordscape, because if you look at the way hieroglyphs work, they are obviously visual representations of stuff, and you have an evolution of the language. So it starts off with these beautiful pictorial forms. It then turns into hieratic, which is a priestly shorthand version of hieroglyphs, and then it becomes into the even less decipherable demotic, which is a shorter hand again version, like language of sort of common writing of the people. So the way that nearly all ancient Egyptian dream interpretation works is that it's wordplay, punning, and homophones, and the images that you see in a dream translate as being words that are similar sort of phonetic value wise, or in terms of the way they sound, to something else. And so nearly every single dream interpretation is about wordplay and punning. And when I started to look at my own dreams like that, it really emphasized the value of writing things down, because sometimes you don't see some meanings, because unless you're writing the word down, you can miss some of the little clues. And I think, this is another thing, the act of writing itself has changed so much. We now write on a computer nearly exclusively. And I'm really into fountain pens and I love writing. And recently I've started to invest a lot more energy after writing my sort of script, my book manuscript. I've really started to enjoy again writing with a fountain pen and making notes. And in and of itself, like, writing is an art, and you do get into a trance-like state when you write with a pen, and things kind of, you start to conjure up images and ideas by the process of writing in a way that you don't necessarily do that when you're writing on a laptop or a computer. And one of the things that interested me as well is this idea of handedness, because I'm left-handed and a lot of people in my family are left-handed, and we all seem to have weird dreams. And I wondered about, the micro movements that you're making with your left hand, whether or not that has implications in terms of sort of neural connectivity in the right hemisphere of your brain, or perhaps contributes to exercising certain neural pathways that might facilitate remembering dreams a bit better. So I'm making a lot more effort now to write more often, because I've always written a lot and drawn a lot as a child. And I've noticed that with this new kind of dominance of digital technology and using laptops, I've been doing it a bit less. So I'm trying to get back into doing that more.
That's fascinating, isn't it? The idea that maybe the dreamscape is different with somebody who is left-handed rather than right-handed, because effectively there's implications here for the structures of the brain, in the sense of how the non-dominant hemisphere is probably more used by somebody who is left-handed rather than the other way, rather than a right-handed person. So therefore, there are different, as you say, with neuroplasticity, there are different communication pathways taking place within the brain, which is developmental, isn't it? As we develop. And of course, with the changes in the way we do things, and I never really thought about this before, that we don't write anymore in the same way. I mean, I'm like you, I love making handwritten notes. I've got, books full of handwritten notes, and I enjoy doing that. And it's because you feel a much greater relationship with what you're writing when you're not typing it, when you're actually writing it itself.
I think it does give more opportunity for like genuine inspiration to arise as well. It's, I'm super into this idea of what inspiration really is, because sometimes I get these moments of feeling divinely inspired. And I think, Mnemosyne, my book is called Initiation into Dream Mysteries, Drinking from the Pool of Mnemosyne. And she's the goddess of remembrance. And she's also the daughter of heaven and earth. And I think it's not unimportant that she's the mother of all of the muses. So she's the source of all divine inspiration. And if you look at the muses, they're all things that bring you divine, not just inspiration, like that sense of joy and euphoria of not just writing something amazing, but reading something amazing, that sort of poetic reverie that you get when you read something that you think is really beautiful, or that moment of being moved when you listen to a piece of beautiful music. And even, which I think is much neglected these days, laughing. Thalia is the muse of comedy. So when you're like in ecstasy because you're laughing so much and you're feeling so full of joy and brimming over with happiness, that's also inspiration. And, I think it's really meaningful that Mnemosyne is the kind of guardian of dream remembrance and also the mother of all of the muses, because inspiration regularly comes to people in the dream state.
And one of the things you and I have discussed is that wonderful feeling of when you look back on something you've written and you have that kind of sense of disassociation, because you remember writing it, but you don't necessarily remember creating it, if that's not a contradiction in terms, because you don't see sometimes the full impact of what you're writing when you're writing, because you're looking at it in isolation, word by word. But of course, it's in sentences and it's in paragraphs. And it's when you see the paragraphs coming together, you realize that inspiration comes from a source somewhere deep within ourselves that we don't necessarily control. And of course, we can then link to this to automatic writing, and the strength of automatic writing. Are we in a fugue state when we're writing in these kind of things? But I'm very interested in as well is in the role of, I can never get it right, Mnemosyne. And right, good. Okay, well, we'll say that word, just the word. And the way in which it's the antithesis of something I've written about over the years, of the waters of the Lethe. The waters of the Lethe were the waters of forgetting. So you drank them in order to forget your past life, forget what you were before you became a shade and you ended up in the Elysian fields or whatever. Whereas it's the remembering. And of course, we then look into the etymology of the word remembering. It's remembering, it's re-putting something together again, as opposed to dismembering, which is taking apart. And it's as if we all seem to be in a state of amnesis. And of course, then we have the wonderful term of anamnesis, the loss of forgetting. So these are something that's very deeply enrooted within Greek philosophy. And clearly all to do with dreaming and dreams. So moving on then, so can you take us through a little bit about the history of dreaming? Because I know you go right back to Mesopotamia and everything. So can you just give us a kind of a very, well, as brief or as long as you want it to be, overview of how dreaming has developed through these different cultures and environments?
Well, I really think that dreaming probably inspired religion and ideas of an afterlife, because one of the most meaningful experiences of dreams is that you can interact with dead people. And I think this would have had a huge impact on ancient people. So the earliest evidence of dream incubatory practices seem to be forms of necromancy, so ancestor worship.
Can you just explain, when you use the term dream incubation, can you just explain to everybody what you mean precisely when you use that term as well?
Dream incubation is really just about dreaming with intent. So dreaming of extracting some information, of meeting a dead person or meeting a divine entity. So dream incubation is really just dreaming purposefully.
Okay.
So the earliest rituals around that look like they're tied in with ancestor worship, with necromancy, with sleeping in graves and tombs and things like that, to connect in dreams with the deceased. And so the evidence is obviously really difficult, but my ideas are speculative about these practices in somewhere like ancient Anatolia. So if you look at the settlement of Catalhoyuk, in the little dwellings that they built there, they've got these beautiful sort of honeycomb dwellings, really highly decorated. When it was first discovered, they thought it must be a religious center, but later it's thought that they're all just dwellings of families. And purposefully, the remains of the people that died there became intramural burials. So they're inside the buildings themselves, and there were sleeping platforms built on top of them. And that was just an everyday sort of habit of sleeping on top of the bones of deceased people. So to me, because these are intentional sleeping platforms, because you can differentiate between the hearth and places used for storing food or cooking food or preparing food, with these sleeping platforms where the bones of the deceased were like underneath these sleeping platforms. So for me, that suggests that the dream space was always this space where in dreams you can interact with the ancestors, with the dead, and that there's this concept of some other world where once you die, you live and you can still operate, and that is accessible to living people through dreams. And that theme can absolutely be seen in ancient Near Eastern philosophy and ancient Egyptian philosophy as well, that dreams are this portal to a realm where the dead are existing, and that the dead can have influence in the lives of the living as well, that it's not just one way, it's a two-way street.
And how far back is Catalhoyuk? How long far back has it been dated?
Well, that's like not long after Göbekli Tepe. So at the moment they're saying Göbekli Tepe is like 12,000 years old, but it could be older than that as well.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
And I think that this is Stone Age, this is Stone Age and Neolithic, rituals around death and the afterlife that are just about as ancient as you can get.
Which is not surprising, is it? Because if you're living in a culture that, you are not in control of your environment as we are, as we like to believe we are. So therefore, there's nobody there to tell you that dreaming is anything other than an alternate point of reality. And as you say, if you dream and you encounter somebody that's recently died, or your loved ones that have died in this dream state, there is absolutely no reason. It makes rational sense to come to the conclusion that you are actually interfacing with these people. So it's not at all surprising that we start to develop this double universe of the here and now and the place you go when you're asleep. And do you think even in those distant times, do you think that entheogens and psychedelic substances were being used, or do you think it was just straightforward dreaming, or we don't know, I suppose?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, there obviously wasn't this categorization of plant species that we have these days, or this idea of using plants as drugs. I just think there was a much stronger sense of being blended with the natural world. So I do think that there would have been a different perception of reality. It makes sense to me. I mean, one of the things I'm really interested in researching at the moment is ancient mirrors and how material culture affects personal perception. So if you look at the history of the mirror, some of the earliest mirrors ever discovered are kind of contemporaneous with those sleeping platforms at Catalhoyuk, with Göbekli Tepe. They're like 9,000 years old. So there's almost certainly ones that are older than that, made out of obsidian, polished obsidian. And if you think about ancient people not being able to regularly observe their reflection, this boundary between self and other is completely dissolved. You're only really catching a glimpse of yourself in reflections of water. And these mirrors are items of magic and prestige that were buried with the elite members of a community. And if you look at later Anatolian ritual magic, a mirror is associated with feminine sorcery, with power to change the future by, for spell working purposes. And I think that is because in the reflection of a mirror, you have access to this other world in the same way that you do have dreams. You have this representation of a sort of facsimile of reality. And if you so intent into that other reality, you can change this reality as well. And I think that there's very much this idea that you can use dreams for magical purposes and that they can be used to predict the future as well. And I think that this all stems from really ancient perceptions of the world and the cosmos, of this nothing is separate, we're all just part of the fabric of the cosmos. And as we've become more and more kind of individualized or separated from that, it's harder for us to understand how, like we were saying before, how people worship the sun. But actually, worshipping the sun makes complete sense. It's like there's a church opposite me. They worship Jesus and a God that's a bearded dude living in a cloud. There is an actual sun that I see every day, that I can see rise, and I can stand on the beach and pray to it, and it's a real thing. And so it's actually way more logical.
Absolutely. I love your observation there about mirrors and the way in which, in a society that mirrors are not common, as you say, the only time you would see your reflection is in the water. And and it's an interesting thought about, how do we consider ourselves to be individuated? And it's because we have a sense of selfhood, because we see our reflections all the time. And of course, one of the things, again, and I'm thinking aloud here, but when I was a kid, the idea of seeing yourself moving, being filmed, was virtually unknown. I mean, nobody had a cine camera in the early 1960s. So the only time you would ever see yourself as being yourself would be in photographs. And I do recall it was quite extraordinary. I remember way back in about 1966, I think it was, there was an incident took place in one of the local towns to me. And one of my school friends happened to be passing when the TV crew were filming. And he was on television that evening. And it was just extraordinary to see somebody that you knew moving in a different way from the way they normally move, in black and white, and being different. So even nowadays, one wonders the effects that's having now with almost the disassociation of personality, because now we have deep